Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Before we begin today's program, I wanted to talk briefly about a past guest, Jesse Ball, and an offer he has made to listeners on behalf of the program. I suspect many of you know who Jesse Ball is, since he was recently a guest on Between the Covers, and yet is already the second most listened to episode of all time. If you don't know him, you should definitely check out our conversation and explore his work. Jesse Ball sent me copies of his 2006 book that he co-wrote with the Icelandic poet and novelist Þórdís Björnsdóttir, called Vera and Linus, to offer as gifts for people who support the Between the Covers Patreon campaign. Vera and Linus is a gorgeous object, full of illustrations, and made with care by an Icelandic small press. The story is composed of a mixture of what could be called prose poetry, flash fiction, and sketches, and Publishers Weekly says of Vera and Linus, the light touch and often archaic feel of the prose owes as much to Kafka as to classic fairy tales. Certainly, many readers will find this book unsettling, but most will also find it hard not to remember a time when the world was filled with this kind of fearful mystery and wonder. Vera and Linus is out of print. The Icelandic publisher no longer exists, so this is a rare memento. For people who are not already supporters of the program, if you begin ongoing support of the show at $2 an episode through Patreon, that is patreon.com, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, you can receive a copy of Vera and Linus. If you're already a supporter either via PayPal or Patreon, you likewise can get a copy by increasing your support by $1 an episode, or if you're a PayPal supporter, beginning a Patreon support at $1 an episode. Again, this is at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, Eileen Myles, is the author of more than 20 books of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, librettos, and plays. As a poet, they came into being through the St. Mark's Poetry Project in New York City in the 1970s, studying under the likes of Alice Notley and Ted Berrigan, and ultimately becoming the artistic director at St. Mark's in the mid-1980s. In the late 70s, they published the poetry magazine Dodgems that is described as a collision of New York school language poetry, performance texts, unconventional prose, and tossed-off notes from neighbors and celebrities. In the same era, Myles also co-edited the feminist anthology Ladies' Museum and worked as an assistant for the poet James Schuyler. The early 1990s saw a leap in Myles' visibility with the release of their poetry collection Not Me from Semiotext, their write-in candidacy for president, and the release of the novel Chelsea Girls. It was also in the 90s when Myles toured Germany with Kathy Acker, Lynn Tillman, Richard Hell, and Chris Kraus, and co-edited the anthology The New FU Adventures in Lesbian Reading. Since 2000, in addition to the poetry collections Myles released, Myles published the novels Cool for You and Inferno, a Poet's Novel, wrote the libretto for the opera Hell, released the essay collection The Importance of Being Iceland, Travel Essays in Art, and created and directed the performance piece The Collection of Silence, which involved dancers, poets, children, visual artists, and Buddhists in a collective public act of silence at the Hispanic Society in New York. As a poet and art journalist, Myles has appeared in a wide range of publications, including Art Forum, The New Yorker, Harper's, The Nation, The New York Times, and The Paris Review. They are the winner of 4 Lambda Literary Awards, the Clark Prize for Excellence in Art Writing, and the Shelley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. And most recently, Myles has had both a significant retrospective moment with the reissue of Chelsea Girls and the release of their new and selected poems, I Must Be Living Twice, both from Echo Press, and the introduction of their work to a new audience with their poetry featured in season 2 and 3 of the show Transparent, with a character on the show being modeled after Myles and with Myles also appearing on the show themselves. As if that were not enough, Myles is also the recent recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, which facilitated the writing of their most recent book that we're talking about today, Afterglow, a dog memoir. Writer Colm Tóibín says of Afterglow, following Eileen Myles around a dog is like following Leopold Bloom around Dublin. Reading Afterglow is like entering the company of a sensibility that is rich, original, witty, and tonally brilliant. It is the darting asides, the phrasing, and the subplots that matter most in this book that give pure, sheer, constant pleasure. Chris Kraus adds, what is a dog if not God? In Afterglow, Eileen Myles steps up to the challenge for writers to function as prophets. Ghostwritten in part by deceased pit bull Rosie, this dog memoir explores, among other things, geometry, gender, mortality, evil, aging, and plaids. Myles makes new rules for what prose writing can be. Afterglow is Myles's funniest, profoundest work yet. Welcome to Between the Covers, Eileen Myles.
Hey, David.
Hey there. Well, if we look at your two novels that precede Afterglow, you called Cool for You a nonfiction novel, and Inferno is a poet's novel. Mm-hmm. And you've also talked about wanting to mess with the term novel.
Right.
And it feels like memoir comes with a lot that people bring to the word memoir, to an expectation of a memoir. And I was wondering, because I feel like Afterglow could be a nonfiction novel also, but you're calling it a dog memoir. So tell us if you're also trying to trouble that term, and if so, in what way?
Right. Well, it's so funny. I mean, I think the term memoir is troubled, you know? I mean, I remember, like, I don't know if it was in the 90s or even the aughts, when there just suddenly, when there became like a rush of memoirs. And I remember this kind of mainstream elders sort of sneering and saying these are like half-lives. You know, like a memoir is supposed to be the grand old man or woman, but mostly guys who had lived an enormously long, life and had incredible things to talk about of great significance to everyone. And it would be, some younger woman having some story to tell about something that wasn't, like a political, supposedly, And so, and I've always liked nonfiction, and it's sort of a little, it definitely in its newer forms and its sort of raggediness. And I came up at a time when new journalism was like really hot stuff when I was in college, like Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion and Hunter Thompson, and it was like wild. And it just seemed like poetry and the day and politics were all merging in this way, and everybody is kind of jazzy. Like people were just kind of improving with where they would bust the boundaries. And but for me, it still always seemed like memoir had to do with some recitation of truth, or it too often, like Oprah's mad at James Fry because his memoir wasn't actually true. And so I felt like it always seemed more contractual than anything I ever wanted to do, But when my dog started dying, I just started writing because that's what I do. That's what I know how to do. And it just was this accumulation. And I thought it was simply a nonfiction book that was about her. So it almost like kind of titillated me that I thought, okay, this can be a memoir because it's about a dog and she really is dying, and I really do want on. My desire was simple and sentimental, and so I thought I would go with it. But of course, the messing with the form came later when I had basically shot my 50-page wad of what her dying was. And then it was the aftermath, which kept turning into other things and multiplying and becoming metonymic and frothy and foamy. And so it just, I think the thing with a book, period, is that it always becomes a writing workshop with oneself. And so after that first burst, you have to figure out how to keep going and how to construct that going. And so all of that wound up being like a memoir. I think, the book was, for a long time, it was called My Dog, and it kept being referred to as the dog book by the time and then I think accidentally I was in Provincetown, and there was an after-season arts festival called Afterglow, and I had the postcard up over my desk, and I was like, wait a second, And so when it became that, it still seemed like it kept being called the dog book. So it was very late that we decided to. But I think I knew it was a memoir. I mean, to answer your question, I kind of I knew it was that, and I loved how much I was deforming that.
Yeah, and you mentioned two things that I wanted to bring up. The one, in the larger sense, this sense of expectation around authenticity and sincerity that it comes with the memoir, but then the particular expectation around pet memoirs of sentimentality or this expectation of a certain type of book. And you've mentioned that you didn't want to write a sappy dog memoir, but you wanted to write an itchy dog memoir. So can you talk about what considerations go into writing an itchy dog memoir, one that, while maybe looking at sentiment, is also sort of undermining that expectation?
Well, I mean, I think it's the things you don't want to see. I mean, it's like to really focus not on what a wonderful dog she was, but more what it was like to see that creature corrode. How icky and awful and exhilarating the dying of a loved one is. It was this participatory. So I thought it, like, to let it be as dark as hell. I thought it would be a punk account of a dog dying, and I think that I think of a lot, and because I thought of it when I was writing it too, was that when Frank O'Hara died, Larry Rivers got up at his memorial and told people what Frank looked like in the hospital before he died. Like, he was swollen, he had tubes going in and out of him. It was just this kind of, and it always seemed like this amazing, like action of an artist. To say, here, look. I mean, like Baudelaire, it's like our modern sense of beauty is an ugly thing, which is that thing that why we, in America, which is so crazy and conservative, we want, a memorial, a war memorial. We don't want to see some ugly thing that looks like war. We want to see some like beautiful,
right.
And I wanted to do the ugly thing, which turned out to be a beautiful thing, and it just has lots of resonances too with AIDS, because I just was with, those are my friends, Tim Dugos, just people known and unknown who were very close to me that I saw be covered in lesions, and gorgeous, mostly men who southern withered down into a bone and just swollen lips. And it was like we witnessed that, and yet I never did the whole thing with anybody, and I did the whole thing with Rosie, and that seemed really special.
And that's what was amazing to me, is that the times that I most noticed myself tearing up were the times when you were cleaning Rosie's butt, or she was having trouble with using her legs, and there was a sense of failure and imminent demise. And there was also the sense of sort of the routine logistics of doing that too. But somehow in that there was, like you think of a sentimental dog memoir, we think, okay, it's going to make me cry. Mm-hmm. But here we are in Afterglow, and it's these things that are never mentioned in those other memoirs that are doing that instead.
And there's like this radiance. And also just the thing about a dog, of course, is that what you don't share truly is language. And yet somehow that was the space in which she would allow me to take care. You know what I mean? It was just like, she was a proud dog. She wanted to get to the door by herself and go out and pee in her yard, and yet she couldn't do it. And there was shame and pain, and then you were being allowed by that creature to serve her.
Yeah.
Which was kind of amazing.
Can we hear a little bit of the prose?
Yeah. Rosie began dying in June, having those mysterious fits. At the end of each was a puddle of piss. I went to my meeting on Adams Ave in the evening, and I talked about it. The one near the park with the working people, the beautiful dog walker, the pale, curly-haired man who taught law and came in covered in sweat, almost naked from running. One night he and I stood on the sidewalk under those shady trees. He said, "My name is Philip, lover of horses." He smiled. I thought he was flirting with me, but it was part of his euphoria. I understood, because I was the one with the dying dog. My friend, the older woman, said, "You've got to stop." I was biting my fingers. "My dog is dying." I kept saying it. I wash her ass, and then I wash all the towels. One evening I was feeling a little extra naked after describing the ritual of mopping her piss, and I thought, that's it. She's God. And I felt so calm. I found God now. My God, my dog, I chuckled. That's it. Our room. This is ecstasy, and everything got bright. She's dying, and I'm watching her. I'm not thinking about it. Not that that makes any difference. I got this intention, this understanding. Did anyone ever say suffering was about difference? It sops it all up. We are this picture of ourselves now, Rosie and I, and we want to be seen. I took such care of her when she was dying. I relished it. She made me go slow. I'd hear the rustling of her limbs, and I'd rush to her because she couldn't get up, and there was generally a puddle already there. In my house, I have beautiful wooden floors. Now I had a pile of face cloths, torn towels, rags. I'd mop up her urine with a clean, dry towel, and then I'd come back and wash her ass. I'd come back with a damp one, wash it again, and then I'd wipe her dry. I made sure she was really comfortable. I'd do it with love. I intended my dog's ass, the collapse of her rear legs that I saw as little high heels. I imagined her a drag queen or a young girl unsteadily teetering, a touching failure. I swooped in and made it better, made it comfortable. I felt loving. I felt like a god, too. I felt less ambivalently loving than I have ever felt in my life. Now I know what love feels like. I do it and I think it. I love feeling this. Love loving your doggy ass. My home became a shrine. The bird of paradise around the door, the late night and early morning dog barking in the dark canyon beyond the yard. When I bought the house, it said on the deed, disclosures, dogs in canyon. What could that mean? Hundreds and hundreds of dogs barking day and night. Not all the time, just when any one of them got an idea, then they all got it. There's a growly picture of me standing in the screened-in porch light flooding in over that canyon, and I look like an animal. But the animal looks great. You see a movie sometimes in which someone is doing something really difficult, waging war, defending their family, walking very far and very long, and they look terrific, they look great. The hair looks good, the person looks, well, they look hot. And I would watch these spectacles with a doubleness. I'd keep watching because unless a movie is really bad, I'm usually enthralled, but I always think no one would look so good doing that. But in fact, people often look radiant suffering. How often have you told someone they look fabulous and they say thanks because I feel terrible? And you can see it right behind their eyes. Terrible puts a candle in there. Terrible turns on the light. You wonder if people are just empty when they're moving forward with the plan, when it's all on the outside and the world is full of light. But when you suffer, the light is in. It's all yours.
We've been listening to Eileen Myles read from her latest book, Afterglow, a dog memoir. You mentioned earlier both the fact that the main separation between you and Rosie is the absence of a shared language, and also that the first 50 pages are the place where we really get you being intimately connected to your dog as she's dying. And it feels like that's the area where I feel like we're most like intimately connected with the two of you on the, what I would say, I don't know, the closest heart level. But then there's something that happens before what you read, which I think keeps us on uneven ground. And that's the fact that the book opens with you being served a subpoena or something from the lawyer of your dog,
right?
Yeah, a test case on behalf of Dog Nation, based on the various ways dogs have been subordinated to the human species. Which I would love for you just to talk about that, because it's interesting to experience this very moving love that you have for Rosie, but then also to know that the dog, on the other hand, has been getting people on its side to essentially interrogate the acts that you've done previously that we don't know about yet.
I mean, I think the thing that's so funny about having a dog is that you, no matter what you do, you feel like you are somehow being unjust to your dog. I mean, the thing is you've got this being, this mammal living with you that is completely dependent on you for food, for walks outside. They can't pee, they can't not fail unless you take the responsibility of getting them out there. And I can just, as a person who's lived in New York most of their adult life, I can just think of a million times when I was going out at night. I had some important thing to do, and then I thought, oh, I gotta walk Rosie, and then I would take her out for a drag, like really a horrible 10 or 7 minute walk, and she could just tell by the streets we were on that this was a bad deal, that she was not going to get to someplace she liked, she was not going to see other dogs, she was not going to play, she was just going to urinate and go home and be in all night, and so she would take this pokey walk, and then I would get to my building and walk her up the stairs, and I would just keep turning as I was trying to yank her up the stairs even faster. And I would see this look that again, there's certain words we can't see, but say on the radio, but it would be like, bleep you, Eileen, bleep you, because I just felt like this dog is furious at me.
Yeah.
So I feel like that tank of projected feeling that I know was there in whatever way it expressed itself wound up producing a document at the head of the book, which was simply a letter from Rosie's lawyer on behalf of all dogs, suing me for all the crimes against a dog. And it's so interesting. I mean, I think it was pointed out to me, I was just in Los Angeles, and it was more of the epicenter of some of the stuff that's going on culturally right now about men of power in relationship to women and potentially, I suppose, men who have less power than them, and sexual assault and abuse and all that. And so there's even a document in here called The Rape of Rosie, in which I talk. I mean, it's horrendous. I read it at a bookstore in Los Angeles last night, and essentially it just, I wanted my dog to have puppies. And so I didn't want to have a baby, but I wanted my dog to have a baby. And so I forced her to have sex when she did not want to do it, and I described it. And it was so disturbing. I mean, in the room, you were like, how can this not be a crime? She's not into it, and so it was just, I felt like it was very, to take mammalian responsibility towards these creatures. So it's funny, I'm both sending it up and kind of horrified with the awesomeness of my crime, in terms of loving and owning and dispensing my own sick sense of justice towards this dog.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that's one of the most amazing parts of the book is that chapter, but I didn't want to use the word amazing because I was also horrified. So it's that strange feeling of, like, from a dramatic literary perspective, I thought that chapter was profound, but also the one that I'm still unsettled by at the same time.
Yeah, and very much the letter from the lawyer came from that chapter.
It did.
I mean, what I mean is just emotionally, I think that's like a big big piece of the trigger. Why? Yes, you would sue. Yes, because that's what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah.
People are making claims against their quote masters.
Yeah, and so one thing we learn right off, so we learn that Rosie's going to have a voice. So Rosie's going to have a voice in this book, and one of the really great parts about the letter we get from the lawyer is your name is in quotes, in scare quotes, just like Rosie's is, because Rosie never got to choose her own name. And so why would they grant you like this a better status around your name? So you're in scare quotes, which really, it's going back to this idea of like a contract around a memoir, like who's speaking in Afterglow becomes less and less clear, or, it's very polyvocal. But it made me wonder, just in a greater sense, you've talked about writing as performance, and you've also taught classes on what you call performance writing. So could you talk about performance with regards to writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fun. I think honestly, I think writing is performance. The act of writing is always that, because I mean, there's for so many reasons. One, I mean, I think when I write, I feel so much more that I'm hearing. Like I'm kind of listening to something, and I'm doing the writing for it. And so there's some way in which it's sort of like, as a body, I think you're a little bit. I think people who write are sort of the same people who read, and what is reading? What is the act of reading? You're taking other voices, other passages of time, other social realities in, and you're creating this cycle, and I think when people say, I always wanted to write a book, I mean, I think that hopefully means they've read a book that they've loved, that they're a participant in this flow, and sometimes at some point it'll flow back, but does it, and I think when you sit down and become somebody who does it and writes the book, you're performing that action, which is to make there be more such text, more such voices in the world. But I think that there's another thing. I mean, I think I got up and read my work before I ever published my work, and part of it just was that it was harder to get published than it was to stand up at an open mic, and so it was just like when I got to New York in the 70s, and I did what everybody did before I came to New York, and while I was in New York at the beginning, which was that I sent my poems in to the places that everybody knows about. So that was like the New Yorker, Paris Review, or I'd go to some bookstore and I'd see a magazine called Caterpillar. You know, there were certain magazines that were around in the 70s and 80s, Kayak, and everybody sent their poems to them, and then you would get these like Xeroxed rejection slips that usually didn't even have a little note, and so when I got to New York and realized there were other options, you know, and they became about publishing too, but the first one was to stand up at the mic, which was so cool because, again, I was like of the generation of the singer-songwriter like Joni Mitchell, and she tapes her regrets to the microphone stand, you know, and we all heard lines like that and one, like, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Except I didn't sing, I didn't play a guitar, so I was going to do it as a poet, you know. So it felt like when you got up at the mic, you were performing, and I went pretty far with that because then I met people who had little magazines. I realized you didn't have to send it to the New Yorker; you could pass it to the guy next to you in the workshop. That you were in a community of writers and publishers, and I started to become part of that and publish my own magazine and so on. But also. By the 80s, performance art was so much huger than poetry. And at first, all it seemed to be was you just memorized your poems. And so instead of the burden of paper or a book in front of an audience, you would just get up and be it. And so there was this kind of embodiment. And then there were people like Spalding Gray or Karen Fenley who were like kind of more storytelling, you know, and would just, you know, and I fooled around with that. And that's what led me to run for president, basically. I was, instead of memorizing texts, I was performing the practice of improvising a story in front of an audience and learning how to speak publicly, and that led me to the active citizenship, which was running for president, which actually this dog got roped into as my running mate. But so that all, but I think the end of the story really is that once you've done all that and kind of memorized and talked and done all these different ways and then taught, you know, and all the different kinds of locations in front of people, it's just like by the time you get back to like being at the mic with a piece of paper or a book and reading, you're a performer.
Yeah.
You know?
But you've also mentioned that when you're not at the mic, when you're writing, that sometimes you're imagining that you're writing towards a specific person. Like, you imagine an audience?
I imagine individuals that I want to understand me. It's like, or people that I have crushes on, or people that I have one more thing to say, or somebody that I think will think this is funny.
Yeah.
You know, I'm often amusing myself or somebody else, you know, so there's just a lot of...
that audience of one might shift throughout a project?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard like... The late John Ashbery has a great book called 3 Poems, and it's prose, so that's the first joke of it. But apparently he said that when he had a therapist, I don't know if it was in New York or Paris, who he was telling his therapist about all these feelings he had about all these different people, and the therapist is like, well, why don't you write something and talk to all those different people? You know, and so this work that is formally so exciting and challenging is actually a multivocal performance. And John claimed that he didn't remember who those people were anymore.
Right.
And I think I feel the same way. I'm not sure who I was obsessed with in the 10 years that it took to write this book.
Well, I was curious about if you had a notion of self. And one of the things that I read that you've said that when you moved to New York from Boston, that you performed the role of the Boston working class poet, and you are a Boston working class poet,
Right?
But you also were performing that role in
Right.
this community that you were entering. Can you talk a little bit about that, and if at all, how it reflects back on your notion of what a self is, if you have a notion of what a self is?
Right. God, the last part is the hardest part in a way, but I think that. We're like thinking animals, right? I mean, like, I think that's the difficulty, and I think that's why we bring animals into our lives to kind of like enhance certain things and experience them differently. But I think when theoretically, when people talk about being female, being queer, being of color, there's a doubling all the time. If there's an idea that you're not in power, if there's an idea that you're standing out in some way, that people are looking at you in a certain way. Certainly every woman who came to New York at a certain period of time, and maybe today, you would like, hey, look at my poems, and people would be like, hey, look at her ass, and it was just like, you think you're in one exchange, but you're actually in the other, and it's like a bait and switch all the time. And so I think I write with that, I know that what I'm writing is being received in some other way, and then sometimes I start to then think of that other way and then write into that a little bit, and then I realize, I think it's so interesting. It's sort of like often you think you're performing and then you realize it's actually, these are your true feelings. You just thought you were like, auditioning this or and likewise, when I came to New York, I suddenly was struck by this sense that, oh, all these kids went to private schools, and they probably, or people would pick up on my accent instantly and think that, like whatever feelings they had about Boston or whatever feelings they had about working class people, and then add female to that, and then add heavy drinker to that, and so there was just a way in which the best defense is a strong offense, and I think my offense was to somehow be a cartoon of myself, which then sometimes was very accurate. Sometimes, you see videotapes of yourself when you were younger and you were like, I can't believe I said that, And I think your own vulnerability, just as you think you're being strong or tough or powerful, you're being incredibly readable and really vulnerable and just, kind of pathetic, but sort of great, and so I just think that it's just such a negotiation and such an improvisation, managing yourself, especially, like in Boston, people were like, hey, Lena, what have you been doing? And in New York, it was like, what do you do? And they don't mean, how did you spend your day? They mean, why are you here? What is it you're going after, and how much of it do you have now? And it just was like, very alarming, and I was in a different class in a way, and maybe the no class of the artist class, but as we know, there's lots of hidden class values in that, and so in a way, you're playing to all of them, and each one has a different vocabulary, and then you start code switching, and so it's like, yeah, where's the self in there? I'm not sure. I think it's the performing entity.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because I think one of probably the funniest part of the book for me, but also perhaps the deepest part, is when Rosie, your dog, goes on the puppet talk show. And there's a show run by puppets with the Puppet Nation is watching Rosie. And Rosie is talking about a human career being like a puppet show or a magic act. And in that same section, Rosie says, it is not what is inside you that matters. The inside is empty. Mm-hmm. And it made me think of your role on Transparent, how there's a character on the show that's loosely modeled on you. And that character is reciting your poems as her poems. Uh-huh. And you're on the show as someone else,
right,
watching someone being you reading your art.
Right.
And it made me wonder, I guess, around, maybe you've already answered this, but I wondered if you thought that the inside is empty, if you agreed with your dog that the layered story is the true story, if it's this layering potentially upon an emptiness underneath that is the self.
Right. Well, I think we're in this curious position of being writers and thinkers in a time when there's so many possibilities, not just for our own capacity to realize there are multiple ways of viewing us and there's multiple performances in oneself, but that we have this, art of mechanical reproduction that is on so many levels of photograph and video and TV and shows and, just clips and GIFs and, just like we're just in this maze of layers. So I think it seems to me it's like truer than ever, that we're just kind of, everything is water. I think we're sort of trying to dog paddle our way through all these kind of momentary, apparitions or apprehensions, And it was like too, that just to be a cartoon. It's like it's so funny to be a person who I'm so self-conscious, and I think part of it, I don't know. Like for me, I think when I was young and I lost my dad, and I didn't know how to mourn, so I started to perform mourning. I remember I would like go down to the cemetery as myself, and I didn't feel anything, but I would just look and try and like look sad, and I would try and to do various things, like babysitting, doing extra work because I must be poor now. I must be an orphan. Like not knowing how to stage loss. And so actually, where was I going with this? Sorry, I think I lost my train right
That's
there.
all right.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up your dad, because it seems like that's a crucial thing to talk about. In Afterglow, there's a whole bunch of ways in which you have different identities, and also different ways that Rosie has different identities in the book. So Rosie has names for you,
Right.
and you obviously have names for Rosie, but you also are convinced that Rosie is the reincarnation of your dad in the book. So talk to us about that phenomenon, and also about what your dad was like, and why you see or saw your dad in your dog.
Right. Well, for one thing, I sort of got back where I was going, which is to say that I think through a personal loss, which was the loss of my dad as a kid, I think I kind of, like in printing, when they used to do two-color printing, before it was all computers, if you went to put the second color on and you missed and it was off, they would say your registration's off. And I feel like my registration has been off since my dad died, and I started watching myself, perform. And so in a lot of ways, for me, all my writing is trying to get registered, to get back. And sometimes you get registered by making more copies, and sometimes you're trying to recreate that original. But I think, I simply, you have two parents, and sometimes the mother gets paid short shrift because she's there. She simply cares. She simply gets some clothes on you and gets you to school and feeds you. And I mean, my mother, this book is dedicated to her, incidentally. But she was a difficult, strange, charismatic woman. But my dad was the one who very literally, I mean, she was at the business of taking care of us, and whoever she was and whoever she wanted to be was like backseat, But my dad was like he was an alcoholic, he was a showman, and I think I was the favorite kid. He very much saw me. He just somehow or other, I amused him. I can remember the first time I told my dad a joke, and what I got back from it was I had done something astonishing. I told my father a joke. It was a stupid joke, and he laughed, and I was like, whoa, that's an amazing power, and sought to reproduce that, and so I think I'm a fortunate person, and even a fortunate female, in that I think my ego is shored up by this man. And it was like everything I was interested in, whether it was drawing or science. I would be into science, and a microscope would appear, pastels would appear, drawing paper, So it was kind of like he just was this drunken resource. And so he was sort of an ineffectual camera in a way, because he really was he died young of alcoholism, disease. And so I didn't have that support, and it was certainly not even necessarily comfortable support or attention, but it was there, and it made me think that I was special and that I had magic and I could do. So, even I think when I started to write, when I was I assumed I would be good, because I had been brought up by this guy to think I was kind of amazing, and so it's just with all the self-effacingness of that as well, because I didn't go to schools or a system where they were identifying me as a gifted child.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of a weird, awkward tomboy with a bad perm and broken front teeth that was making art.
When you talked about performing mourning, when I was reading the interview you did with Ben Lerner in the Paris Review, you talked about how you were actually as an 11-year-old alone in the room when your dad died, and that then no one talked to you about how that must have felt when that happened. And I couldn't help but put myself in that place and think that I can't imagine not maybe blaming myself at that age. And I wondered, was there something else going on, other than the performance of mourning, figuring out what was my role I was alone in the room with my
Right.
dad, but I guess I was wondering, was there a narrative as an 11-year-old that you constructed that endured because no one was asking you how you felt, so it never had a chance to intersect with what the reality of that moment was?
Yeah, I think even in the book, I have Rosie saying, first you killed your father, then you killed the parakeet, and then you killed me.
Yeah.
And so I think there was certainly, I waited. I just was like, oh my God. When somebody dies, they make all these sounds and they change color. It was just like an amazing performance, and I was so panic struck that I didn't want to do anything until I knew for sure he was dying. and probably, there was like, it was horrendous. He was like at late stage alcoholism, was bad. And so our lives were very rocked by this guy's condition, and so there probably was some part of me that wanted him to die.
Huh.
So all of that. And then I went and got my mother, and then it was, so that I think there was, it was, there's technologies today that maybe could have saved him because he died of a cerebral hemorrhage, you know what I mean? And they had lousy EEGs then, and now they have better ones. And so I've heard of people surviving, but I think, he was on the way out because he was drinking himself to death. So it was all
Right.
kind of related. So I certainly blame myself. I certainly thought it was my fault,
Can we hear some more prose from the book?
Yeah. I knew I would be one alone in my family. I was in the middle, the quiet one, the receiver. I felt the tugging from the male side and another from the female, and those were my siblings. Yet this in-betweenness, this aloneness, hear it now, is holy. I begged my parents fervently for an animal to be an army with me. My story would have moved on so much faster if that dog friend had come aboard so early on. If dog had come into my child life, my father would not have needed to return. He knew this and brought me a small sandy dog I named Taffy, and yet my mother returned Taffy, this male, to the ASPCA the next morning, where he most likely died. His crime? That he had cried through that first long night, as all dogs do. I would have learned so much from him. Get this, I would have been a prophet at 12 instead of 60. But I am very grateful to have had Rosie, and her antecedent, the man, my father. And as it stood, I was alone in my family, alone in my world, my one ally in the house, the man, my father was dying. I do need to talk about, hear it, the orientation of alcoholism in order to talk about my father. As David Bowie suggested in a powerful film, and as certainly Jesus Christ suggested too of the human tribe, we thirst. There's a very simple reason for this thirst. We are fish. The earth was once covered with water, and when the higher being, who I choose to call dog, felt tired of being alone, the waters receded, and suddenly there was land. And the fish crawled to land and grew legs. Why wouldn't dog go into the waters and speak to the fish in another time? Why did the very essence of the fish, some of them, have to change? If you had the powers of a dog who created at least the universe, and I have a feeling dog created many universes, but I don't know how many, I am privy to a great deal of knowledge, but not all. And this is the very nature of my humility, even restraining the waters of alcoholism in my own life, and I know less. And one would assume that dog could do anything, but no, because there are simple laws even dog needs to obey. You cannot speak underwater. Thus there is no poetry, the original speech. Dog wanted to have a conversation with man and the dogs within us, and the fish, frankly, needed to speak. You know how dog accomplished all this. He pictured it. He pictured an earth covered with water, and he pictured it dry. Listen to me. And the fish going up on shore and discovering feet. Dog is lonely. We can see that lonely in every dog's eyes, and that loneliness is love. It causes us to do good things. Hear this. Such is the power of our army, because the enemy of that love is dying. Every dog is fading slow, returning to the waters of time, which is the nature of dog's eyes. His seeing is the sea. Meanwhile, on this earth, on this planet, we are thirsty. Are we brave enough to see this thirst as longing? We want to go home, so we go to the beach. Understand, we wait for night. The little living human is framed as continually by opposites. One of the ways we experience this in the living realm is in the limitations of things. Can we accept this longing, feel it, even maybe occasionally go down to the beach, jump in, dry off, and walk on? Do we accept our fate? The holiest people live by the sea with their dogs. Look at Mary Oliver. That is a saint. But there are a great many challenges to our frame. Think of a mind as a sea, its own inland sea. We can connect to the enormity of others, the sea in them. We can connect to dog, hound of the ocean, as the ancients once said. But there is an agony at first, but maybe a little all the time. A kind of oceanic stretch, aching, impossible thoughts. Some people take a giant leap themselves by being gay. Other people need to kill them, cannot accept the thought, the gay thought, that things are not as solid as they seem. So there are many sudden, inexplicable deaths. How can we abide? There is a sea. There is dog. Can we trust in that deep, silent underwater bark? The ripples allowing a stretching of thought, a wide lookage? To be living in that lighthouse? Thoreau knew it, wrote about it. Yep, you know him. Hear this. To be standing in that light, all that light. Because every day as we are dying, our gaze is getting tiny with that dog. We become sorrowful. We can cry out, wait for this now, and hear her sorrowful, knowing bark. For dog will come to comfort us. We can do evil, be violent, use love as if it were a common bone lying on the ground, an inscrutable bone, using it there, yes. The only true logic is sound. If you don't know, listen. Bend yours. Careful here. An angry murmuring, an ill-placed yelp, a grrr can set off a maelstrom of pain, tragedy, and disease. We need to get it right, to listen well, to not do wrong. We need to abandon our logic and go back. To wait in dog is to get down on all fours, not just on your knees, but to worship the dog privately and wait. The waters are coming. We can, and we will replace the violence with silence and wait. The peace of the dog is promised, and soon will be upon us. His waters will rock and hold us. He is the sleep. He is the night.
We've been listening to Eileen Myles read from Afterglow. There's a film that I thought of a lot when I was reading Afterglow that I wondered whether you'd seen. It was the Laurie Anderson's film, The Heart of a Dog, which is kind of a memoir essay, filmic essay about both her blind dog and the passing away of Lou Reed. Have you seen it?
I have. And I didn't see it for a while, and I was sort of curious. And anyway, yeah, I love that. I love that piece. It's kind of awesome. And I know her a little bit for a long time, and then we just were like, there was a festival in Denmark, and we were both at this summer, and so we like ate together and talked. And she's such a dog person.
Yeah,
it's kind of amazing. I mean, and she has a dog now that is a whole story unto itself, and she's kind of an amazing owner of.
Well, one of the things that I think both that movie and this book share that I really admire is both books are contemplating death of specific people, but there's also a way in which they feel like they're touching upon a certain death happening on the national level, but it's not foregrounded. So in your case, we have the era of George Bush as president, mm-hmm. and George Bush casts a shadow across Afterglow mm-hmm. in a way and makes periodic cameos in the book. And so you've made the idea of a dog mean many things. So you take on your dog's voice. Your dad is your dog. The postman is a dog. God is a dog, and the dog is God. But one of the early definitions of dog in the book is the interns for Bush, who are made to stay in the room while he farts over and over again and stinks them up. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what's going on in the background of Afterglow and why Bush and a little bit of Condoleezza Rice appear mm-hmm. and inform the story.
Right. Well, I think in a way, I mean, some of it's really mundane because it's just as I was writing in my backyard at the beginning of the book, the trees that were in my backyard at the time come into the narrative. You know, the dog is dying, and these are the trees. And then this is the weather, this is the news, and this is the political climate of this moment, you know. And one of the things I didn't know about living in California is that you're really shaped by the news in a way that you're not in New York City. You know, in New York City, I feel very shaped by the people I meet and the encounters and the real life. But somehow in Southern California, you would be in your car so much, and you would just keep getting these bites. And so there was like a higher level of realism. And also I was lonely from my home. I was lonely from New York. And so I read the New York Times in this kind of incredible way, like it was like reality. But I think, you know, of course, George Bush's presidency was shocking in so many ways because, I mean, Reagan was a fool. I think Harry Truman was a fool. I mean, you know, all of our presidents have been many different things, but there have been some very overtly foolish presidents, guys really not equipped for this job. And George Bush was so surely that. And so I think the dog dynamic is you know, kind of master-slave, you know, like subject and master. And there was a way when it became so reversed at that time. It's sort of like to have such an ill-equipped man be the master made us all be sort of doggy. And then to think that those who were even closer, you know, like the young aspiring people, the good kids, the kids who had done right, and what they get is to be submissive to. I mean, you look at the Trump White House right now, and you're like, at what point does, do you feel so humbled by the situation that you've got to get out? Like people say that everybody who's in the Trump White House is a little bit just kind of a little ruined by it, because you've acceded to such dysfunction, and your job is to prop it up. So I think there was just a more cartoony, and I think the relationship between this African American rumored to be dyke conservative Condi was like fascinating and weird, that she was kind of his support system, and they would even play that she loved him. Remember, it was just like she was like they couldn't. Since she couldn't be a lesbian, she had to be in love. The lesbian is always purported to be in love with a certain guy. It's like a trope in TV shows and stuff. There's this like butchy woman, and she just is sad and pathetic and sort of in love with some guy she can't get because she's not pretty enough.
Is it true that you've said before that the term politically correct was a lesbian term that was then co-opted by the Bush administration? Can you talk about that?
Oh yeah. No, it's really funny. It's sort of like in the lesbian, culture, extended culture of the 70s and 80s, but really probably the mid to late 70s, there were just these sort of characters in the culture who were like the people who were always asking that nobody in the room use perfume. Like it was sort of like they were very sensitive to smells, and it was just like, and we're certainly not meat eating, and not like just there was such a list of things that were not okay in this room, and I'm very sensitive to these issues in our community, and I request that you talk this way, not that way, and it was so kind of like controlling, and that those of us who were sort of more loudish and more kind of just messier characters laughed at them, but everybody called them politically correct. Huh. It was those politically correct dykes, and it just meant that they really were always policing your speech and policing. So that's what was so strange, was to suddenly see that flipped into. Some genius located that language and made it be all of us, because that's metonymy, right? Like we suddenly all became the politically correct, those sort of pathetic, laughable people.
Since you said the word pathetic, I was also hoping maybe you could talk about pathetic and the pathetic. And
right.
You've talked before about pathetic literature and pathetic masculinities, and I think you're working on a pathetic anthology.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that word, and then that word in relationship to literature?
Right. Well, it's something that I think it was sort of inherited from the art world, because there was something in the 90s called pathetic masculinity, and it meant guys like Mike Kelly and I guess Tony Asler and sort of that ilk, who were using crafts that were traditionally female and making abject work, stuffed weird dirty bunnies and banners. Like I think Mike Kelly was working class and went to a Catholic I don't think he went to a Catholic high school, but I think grew up in Detroit maybe. And there was a certain kind of like Catholic modernism in the 60s, that like weird banners and kind of a scaly kind of thing, but it was all kind of. Anyway, he just, like they imported all sorts of kind of strange arcane symbols and handmade things, and like the kind of woodwork that Dad did in the garage, and made that all be like high-end art, But the thing that was interesting was that it was also rumored that a lot of these guys had been educated by second wave feminists in art schools, and that so that they were very aware of like women having these big parties and using traditional female crafts to create kind of like strange lesbian funny love cushions and just kind of punky and political things and stuff. And so it was kind of importing that kind of feminism, undermining the feminine to make political statements, and then undermining that as Mike Kelly and all those guys, and creating this kind of pathetic masculinity. And then it became guys being personal, guys talking about their personal life, writing words on the wall, and doing all this stuff that really had been associated with the, like if you look at Mary Kelly, this kind of, like art of Eleanor Anton, was kind of like art of the conceptual art of the second wave art world. And so I took that to literature and started to think about writers I knew who I loved, including myself, I thought, like, what does pathetic mean? And I started to see it used not as political correctness, but like, say, on the right, like what was her name? Cindy something, who had a son who was killed. Sheehan.
Yes,
Cindy
Cindy
Sheehan.
Sheehan.
Her son was killed, and so she parked herself at the end of George Bush's street in Texas. I can't remember the name of the town, and just wouldn't go away and started a protest there. And I remember on right-wing radio, and that pathetic woman,
Yeah.
And what pathetic meant was a woman who wouldn't shut up. There was a woman who was, instead of being meek and mild and knowing her place, she did not know her place, and she was complaining to the President of the United States, and she was getting a lot of other people to complain, and she was taking up a lot of space. And by the same token, I can think of a guy, whether he was straight or gay, maybe he's a little chubby, but in any case, he probably talks a little too much and is a little too sensitive and a little too needy and a little bit not fulfilling the correct profile of masculinity, And so I started to have this idea that pathetic in America meant kind of not kind of being obedient to your gender roles, and it was and just being excessive and kind of spilling over the boundaries. And it seemed like another way, like genre, to kind of like police infusions of feeling that we don't want to hear about. And I thought, well, wait a second, think about the writers that I love. And I thought about my work. I thought about Chris Kraus and I Love Dick. I thought about the poet John Wieners. I thought about aspects of Samuel Delany, parts of Kathy Acker. Everybody is kind of molten and out of place and deformed and extra. And I thought, so this is not straight or gay. This is not avant-garde or mainstream. It's kind of a lush deformity. And so I taught a class on that when I was teaching at UCSD. I had a seminar called Pathetic Literature, and I taught Kevin Killian. I taught Robert Walser, older writers who were part of this. A Chinese writer, San Shui, Canxue, and now there's a woman who killed us, a Taiwanese writer, Chu Maojin, who published a book with New York Review of Books called, I think it was Last Days in Montmartre, and she wrote this kind of very I Love Dick kind of pre-internet weird like novel of letters that she said right at the beginning that she was going to kill herself at the end of the book, and she did.
Wow.
And she's an amazing writer, and she's one of us. She's part of our, so it's so I taught this class, and then we even had the Pathetic Conference, which was really fun. And Chris came, and we showed Valerie Solanas' I Am a Man. And we had, I'm trying to think who else. There were just readings, and people showed films, and and it was just kind of like rich and off and weird. And so I guess in there, because there's a chapter in this book about foam, which is something I began to be obsessed with when I was kind of teaching this pathetic literature seminar. Grove looked at the book and proposed that we make an anthology. And it's funny, I thought of the anthology 10 years ago, and then just, how ideas come and go. And they were like, no, this is, so I love that it's like one book will literally grow out of the next, which is really what happens. I think it is how books happen, but I've never been kind of commissioned by a publisher, and I sort of adore them for that.
Commissioned for the book after.
Well, so they pathetic literature is coming up.
It's coming up.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
yeah.
I want to ask you a couple questions that come from sort of a ghostly or skeletal source, because I was at your talk last time you were here in Portland State, and I have notes, but they don't. But I don't even know it entirely. Like, they're not super fleshed out. But I wanted to ask one just based on the jumping off point from the notes. So in the talk, you were confronting the question of being an artist in America today, among other things, amidst imperialism and what you called the slave economy, and within that context, this idea that we have this deep insecurity that great art is being made elsewhere than America, and that this sort of insecurity that we have points to a certain type of American emptiness. And then you compared American emptiness to the difference between that and the emptiness we think of in Buddhism.
I mean, I think that we've got American emptiness in the White House right now, in a way. I think that's sort of like there's Buddhism, which is like kind of not clinging to things, not clinging to ideas, and kind of even allowing allowing the emptiness that is, the self. And then perhaps you have, quote, enlightenment, which is meaning to kind of embrace breath and radiance and see everything for this fleeting phenomena, which is beautiful and ugly, and everything is in transit. But I think that there's also, like, what do we talk about the, like the apocalyptic conditions of our planet say, like that, like the understanding of like global warming, the understanding of like just raiding the earth and, kind of knocking down all the rainforests and not believing that any of the things that we're being told by scientists, by native people, by the people who have really honored, how limited and how incredibly, self-revitalizing the planet and nature is. It's sort of like all that's sort of ignored. I mean, like I'm saying what we all know, and it's like, but I think everybody knows that we're there. This is my belief now. I think everybody knows we are there at like ground zero in terms of resources. And the question is, do we just try and slow it down and come to an agreement that we're at this place, and if we can derail it, if we can slow it down, if we can do something different, that's an amazing way for the planet to kind of know each other? Or do we just have a party? You know what I mean? Like we just get a big keg and drive as fast as we can and just close our eyes really tight and just, dig our teeth into a big steak and say, woohoo, because that might feel good too at the end of the world. And I think that's what's in the White House right now. And it's like drill, drill, drill. And I mean, so I think it's like in Buddhism, they call this kind of creature a hungry ghost, where you just want to eat everything and you want to devour everything and you just want to, just have as much as possible because you don't want to think or feel, So I think the one, that kind of materialist, kind of emptiness is in power right now, and that's what we're watching, a culture that doesn't care.
Maybe this is a good time to ask you the question of whether you would consider running for president again. You've noted that women have been running for president even before women had the right to vote. And it feels like you're at the height of your visibility right now, and also that we're clearly in an age where there's a sense of anything goes. I mean, the fact that Trump is president, that a socialist, someone who calls himself a socialist, non-Christian, possibly atheist, almost got the nomination for the Democrats. So it's maybe it is as much a time as ever for a queer woman president. Would you consider running against Trump?
I mean, I am so tempted as you describe it.
Yeah.
But I think, and it's funny. It was like even during the election, parts of me just felt like, God, I can almost taste it, because it's such an interesting time, and I feel more experienced, But no, I mean, I think, I think once you've run, this question always comes up, But I think I'm really doing well as what I am and what I'm doing now, which is to be sort of an indeterminate writer, speaking animal person. And I would love a candidate or candidates. I mean, I can't help thinking that the answer is not a candidate, but tons of candidates. And for us to, but really an agreement, which we've never had, which is to say that, I mean, what we really messed up on this time is that when it became clear that it was, whether you like it or not, it was going to be Hillary, everybody drop all your sticks and run to the polls and vote for her, because this other thing could happen and it will be worse for all of us.
Yeah.
So I think it's the purpose of, like having a lot of parties in America was to have a big conversation and then to merge, and make something happen, I mean, I think the problem is the government, right? I mean, look, we're discovering right now that we don't have checks and balances, that it's all really organized so that a dictator could completely take over, and we're at the brink of that right now. Like there's seriously, when Trump actually talks about, with Sessions, about whether the Justice Department will police journalists for saying things, whether they can take away the licenses of, newspapers and radio stations that speak against the president. It's like that, just to even be saying that is so un-American But then even to say something is un-American is to still suggest that America stands for certain things, and I think we're really learning that it doesn't.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, there's a difference between, is it un-American based on what's happened in the past, or is it un-American because it doesn't fulfill our view of America from an aspirational perspective?
Yes, I mean,
because in one way it's super American, and another way it's super not American.
Right. I mean, one of the things I've done since Trump is in power is actually read the people's history of the United States rather than simply owning it as I've done since the 80s, you know? And it was just like exactly what you just said. I think it's like Trump is so American, you know, that, and even, you know, like I went to Palestine for a week in May, which was an incredible, I mean, I was always pro-Palestinian, but to be there and to see that and to hear the language that people used about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and they call it the colonial settlement project, you know, and it was just like, of course that's for the United States. I mean, there's no difference, you know, and it's like that's what empires do, you know, and just the fact that, you know, Israel is being pals with the Austrian Nazi party.
Yeah,
right?
I saw that.
I
It was like yesterday or the day before, right?
Yeah, I was like, come on, wait a sec, come on. Everybody must see that, you know, as being just a signature of you know, wrong government.
Who are your friends?
Yeah, you are your friends. Yeah, I know. I was like, it's an important question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's if you don't mind reading one more section, I would love it. On page 189, I think.
Okay. But the United States, as we know, is a very evil and accidentally spiritual country. It is a Manichaean country. So accidentally pyramids speak on its money, and so accidentally the cadet blue of Persia, a vibrating, speaking color, is the uniform of the common U.S. mailman. And your father Terence was one, Terence meaning tender. It's no accident. Am I still Rosie? Perhaps you should go and look out the window and see the mixed cadet blue sky. It's a magical time and a thief's time. It's little wonder that mailmen worldwide do not simply destroy the mail. In the same way that a chorus of dogs will surely defile and piss on this rug when we are done, the mailman wants nothing better to do than to destroy the mail. Why? All these men and women who are carrying these bags and carriages through the streets of the world, all of them are dogs. Does this not give you a different and a better feeling about the U.S. Postal Service? It was enough for you to learn that there have been mailmen going back in your family's history for as long as there was mail, as long as there was writing. The sky is full of pictures tonight. Cadet blue is made up of millions of pinpoints of light coming through from the other side. Other side of what, you might ask? The holes in the tapestry and the holes in the sky are of the same ilk. It is for the purpose of reproduction. No, of course, there is not just one night like tonight. It has a copy, and that has a copy. It is out there somewhere. The universe is doubled. I, Mani, was given prophecy by my twin. Also, if you look long at the double sky, the double universe posing as one establishes a massaging effect on your optic nerve, will open a sea of images, which is destiny and time. It is open tonight, the night after Christmas. All the messages that were ever sent, will ever be sent, are written in the sky. Why are the postal workers angry? It's not enough to know that they are dogs. Just last night I was told, on Christmas of all time, a sad tale. Of course, Christmas is the saddest day of all for me because Jesus was my other. What day was Mani born? We do not know. No copy of his book, The Arzeng, exists. We hope this book will be that copy. We know that it sat on a chair and it was revered. The dogs who work for the U.S. Postal Service are sending false messages, and it breaks their heart. The sad story I heard last night was that a dog outside of the service had been killed, had been put down for biting a mailman. This is a slow religious war. The dogs who have taken the bodies of mailmen, either from birth or after the time of the age of 13, when a body of one with a weak nature may be intuited, are the natural prey of the dogs in body who are loyal to the picture, not the script. You would think then that dogs would hate writers, but it is not so. Each writer is required to tell a dog story, and so dogs attach themselves to writers to spur on the ghostwriting, and a writer might worry that too many dog books are being written, and no one will be interested in reading hers and buying it, and obviously Mary Oliver has written a dog book. Writing a dog book is hard because the writer is in servitude to the dog most clearly now. The dog has been serving the writer for years, opening up her life and getting her out into the air and onto the beaches and even bringing attractive people into the unattractive life of the writer, who often never goes out. And now, once he, the writer, succumbs, the dog gives pictures to the writer, which the writer transcribes. And we are seeing it here, most particularly in the chapters X, XX, XXX, XXXX, also potentially entitled Transcript or Rosie at 15. Now we think that it shall be entitled and it shall be strewn, and that is wisdom now, in particular when Eileen lays herself down horizontal like a dog so Rosie can have her say. Peggy has spoken, and even the little dethroned one, Hank, he will have his say too, perhaps on a website. Eileen has a dog soul, and it is Rosie. Eileen had a dog soul, and it was Taffy, and Taffy died. Eileen had a dog soul, and it was Walter, and she gave the Walter away and let him be renamed the hideous Nike. She stood on the road like Mani, and she stood too long, and finally even Walter said, "Let me go." Let's put that one right on the tapestry. Pause thumping it. Eileen, right up here, because it is a very sad moment. You were laying on the floor by the door, and you were looking in Walter's eyes, and you were praying. And Walter put his paw out, and he simply meant, Eileen, decide. And you thought he meant, go, Eileen. You were not a free soul then, Eileen, but you are free soul now, and this is why you are doing this great work for me, Eileen, and all dogs. I want to return to the mailman and the letter. What is a letter, Eileen? As your father is floating over the house, and the child with curly hair, with a perm, is agonizingly writing the words, I will not talk in the corridors, I will not talk in the corridors. You are beginning your weaving, Eileen.
We've been listening to Eileen Myles read from Afterglow, a dog memoir. So you're part of this amazing Portland-based project from Phonograph Editions of poetry coming out on vinyl. And by coincidence, you and my next guest, Ray Armentrout, are the first two poets to have their albums released. I want to talk a little bit about it based on your aesthetic. And maybe this is, I don't know if this is related to pathetic literature or not, but how you wanted the messiness of the process to be retained in the recording. And also Jeff from Phonograph didn't want it to be edited either. So it's like this, it feels like a nice marriage of aesthetic, that you wanted the false starts, the sips of water, the rustling of the paper, the cursing, and then there's the last track that you recorded on your phone in Ireland of the wind in the trees. And you had talked about early Bob Dylan recordings that you could hear the frets as he's playing the guitar, and that added something that wasn't a flaw, or and it kept it from being too precious.
And there was laughter in the studio.
Yeah.
And take two and struggles and yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about you mentioned something called acousmatic sound. Can you talk about that and maybe anything else that comes to mind around the process of recording poetry for vinyl?
Well, I think part of it just is the literary world is prissy. You know, I think there's just this anxiety about, fear of people thinking us stupid, and there's publishing, and it's a very, like a very pristine industry. I mean, like it is and it isn't. It's so ridiculous because publishing, as we know, is at a time from the 80s or 90s on, at least mainstream started being taken over by more accountants than, and it was sort of like buying a book was like a purchase. It wasn't, and editors don't really edit and so on. But still, there is this kind of very conservative thing about what writing is and what narrative is and what, standardization on all levels, And I think that the thing that's disturbing about that is it kind of like, it's sort of, language is alive, it's doing all these things it's not supposed to do. It's sort of like when I first heard about like the poet John Clare, who was a contemporary of Keats, and he was like a shepherd, and he wrote his poems like on pieces of paper that he would stick in the band of his straw hat, and he would sleep in the fields, and he spelled funny, and he had a funny accent, and and it just seems so ripe, and when you read his nature poems, he has a book called The Shepherd's Calendar, and it's like, it's almost cinematic. I mean, you could almost see the fish leap, and you could almost smell the, and part of it is the irregularity of the spelling. And it was just like you can feel him reaching for language, and it just makes me think of, like, there's a Charles Olson line about, he says, I like language that still has a little dirt on its roots. And there are words, and there are words that feel old like that, like odd words, like sometimes when you're looking into a word or a spelling or a usage, you suddenly start falling through time, and language is deep, so I think, like, that's true of, like, publishing and printing and on the page, and there's only one, like, there's a standard spelling and there's a standard dialect. And I remember, like, I'm so much a product of the 70s, and when there was suddenly, like, an idea that might be Black English, like in different ways, but still there was one white English, because working class means stupid. Working class means illiterate, and then in other circles, working class means racist, so there's just so many associations that mean, and yet you listen to a Bob Dylan song that wrote, or, like, ain't no use in turning out the light, babe, that light I ever knowed, and it's just song that we memorize and repeat and record always has irregularities that everybody learns, and so I think there was just, like, it was such an opportunity to put that in action when we did that recording, because I think they were just, like, we were either going to go into the studio and make this recording or use something that existed. And even in the making, when I recorded it in Europa, and at a little, there was the Harry Smith recording studio there, and Ambrose Bye, who was Ann Waldman's son, did the recording. And Ann, it was so funny because in the studio, I think I was, like, finishing a poem and doing what I often do in readings, like throwing the piece of paper on the phone, and Anne charged into the recording room to tell me that I shouldn't do that because you could hear the papers, and I knew that, like, Ambrose and I made eye contact, and we were like, I think we're going to go for that sound, so it was really fun that those guys were, like, with me on it, and then I think that inspired me to throw in some Irish trees.
I don't know if this is related, and I don't know that I can recapture what Natalie Diaz said in a talk that I went to of hers, but she did this, the poet Natalie Diaz did a talk on repetition in the uttered word versus the written word, and how, like, there's no such thing as repetition in an uttered word, that it's always different. Every time you utter a word, it's different, and how she's trying to bring the utterance into the written word so that we don't tend to look at the word green written twice as being different. And she gave a lecture basically on that it is different, but how can we make it seem more like utterance? Right,
which is such a great challenge. That's incredible.
Yeah. There's also this mysterious line in Afterglow that I wanted to ask you about. You say, Gertrude Stein is a very great weaver. All writers who use the sonic mode in writing are returning the fruits to the cave. What does that mean? I just thought of that because of the vinyl, because of the words, the sonic mode. Not that that has anything to do with the recording that you did, but do you have any sense of why that's in Afterglow?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like, well, I think even returning the fruits to the cave is like going back to the womb. Can you go? I mean, like, can you go home? I know there's some crazy. There's a great book called Bubbles by Peter Sloterdijk, which I really recommend. And he recounts some story, which is, like, I think a Chinese myth about some woman who was she was pregnant for like 10 years and she gave birth to an old man, and it was just, like, so off and so wrong, and it just kind of gave you this different sense of time. But I think that certainly when I talk about the sonic mode, I mean, like, Stein, what Natalie's talking about is pure Stein. That it's sort of like, it's not repetition, it's insistence, and when you hear something again, it's sort of, and again, I think in my experiences more, I think in journalism than in fiction, when I've written, like reviews or something, they'll say, well, you just use this word, so that using it again is repetitious and stuff. And when instead it's metonymic, it's sort of like, you were here with me then when we all laughed at how somebody said cow. And over here, when we say cow again, it's inflected by that moment we were all there. It's sort of, it's communal. It suggests that we have continued, and I think repetition has that kind of liveliness. And that was exactly what Stein was talking about. And to me, when I first read her work, I thought, oh, it's a voice print. And she has that whole idea. I mean, like, it's how she's declaring herself to be a genius too. But that she has the idea that to be talking and thinking at the same time was the performance of genius.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, truly, I think we're all geniuses. I mean, that's what we're shooting for. Is a genius would be. I mean, like, it's like genie. It's like this having a spirit. It's being with your spirit in the moment of the action. Not being in two places, trying to be one.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed something that when you describe books that you love, that you often use the word excessive as a form of praise. So you say that about Daniel Berzutsky's latest book, and you say that to C.A. Conrad. You say your work saves my life, your excess. And I know you've been reading or recently read Dahlgren by Delaney, and I would suspect you'd praise it as excessive. And you've also said that gender itself creates excess. So talk a little bit about excess.
Yeah.
And is that related somehow to pushing back against the standardization and the preciousness you were talking about earlier, or is it something entirely different?
I mean, why do we have to have, men's rooms and women's rooms? I mean, it's just like that kind of like I feel like all the distinctions that we make are policing energy, policing power, policing authority, and so on. And I think, I think excess is like, whoa, like, like, it's like one of the greatest excessive things I've ever seen was at an artist colony at McDowell where, we would have these, we were to do presentations, and you were to give a 20 or 30-minute presentation. And I think the idea was that, we were all in community and everybody was doing their work. And it was weird because it was sort of a burden in a way that you should have to do a presentation at all. But then if you were going to do it, it shouldn't be too long, And so it was very, kind of socially inflected, the nature of the performance. And then this one guy who was a composer he had clearly lost it over the environment and just had started to care more about the environment and what was going on than music and the composing. And so instead of playing something for us like the other composers or even talking about it, he started showing charts and maps about the environment. And he went on for 2 hours. People were so mad at him, and it was just like, it just wintered down to 2 or 3 of us who were just like, couldn't get enough and were so excited, And I guess, obviously it's like there are kinds of excess that I would flee from too, but it seems to me that it should be available to us, the too much that we want, and to find, texts and experiences and things that will go way off the road, and because we need to be there to, like to kind of rejigger the whole system.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, the fact that he bucked it meant that he was wildly passionate and just something mattered more than music. And I thought that's the kind of composer I am in awe of, because when he comes back to music, if he ever comes back to music, he's going to have something so different.
I bet.
Yeah.
So if we were to imagine your life post Afterglow, I just had a question that came out of your interview with Morgan Parker at the Literary Review, and you were talking about aging and mortality in relationship to your art and your writing practice. And in that interview, you were 64 and said that, of course, you didn't know if you'd live to be 94 or 74 or 65. And then you say, I feel like I need to take this time on as space, and space in which to have my own vision and my own practice. And then you say you're becoming more introverted and that you're ready to Beckett. And so I want to know what that means. Like, what does it mean to Beckett?
Right.
And what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
To Beckett and to take time on his space.
Right.
If that still feels true to you.
Yeah. No, it isn't. It's just like, it was a challenge. I was like, how am I doing? Because I think when I thought about what it might, I was like, when I would assert I want to be Beckett, meaning that every time I ever read an interview with Beckett, it would be like, it was so hard to get an interview with Beckett that it was just like, he lived in Paris, but he talked to very few people, and he just lived in this very obscure way, and everybody honored that Beckett was like that, and and it just seemed so incredibly desirable, and here I am, I'm like a laughing horse or something, and I'm doing a 37 city tour and so on. But and I love this and I love that. But it's the model for what I want for a long time has been that I do something like this for a while and then I just shut the hell up for 6 months or a year or however long and just do my work and because I think time is space, meaning that you can feel that excessive, like I can fill this with anything I want, and because I think I know what there's this book and then there's a screenplay, like a movie project, and I have things that I'm excited about doing, and I'm really excited about doing something that I don't know about. I don't know what that is, and I feel like you get it in that abyss. But if that abyss doesn't exist, I was like, what's the point of getting everything you ever wanted in some way? I mean, like I've always, like years ago, I think, what did I really wanted? Like I wanted a recording of my work. You know what I mean? Like I wanted I wanted a CD of. I wanted a really simple record. And I do. I mean, I've made audiobooks like that. Is great. I love that, and I'm working on a film, and I'm just doing things. I got a good publisher for my Selected. I really wanted that. I wanted Chelsea Girls to come out again. So it's like I'm getting the things I want as a writer, but I feel like what good is it if it doesn't give you what you wanted when you were first a writer, which was this boundless feeling of freedom. To make in. And so that's, I guess that's what I was talking about then, and that's what I still want. And so I guess I would throw out Beckett now and would say I want to be, I want to be Myles. I want to do, which wouldn't, my freedom wouldn't look like his. I don't, but yeah, I want to be in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. It was great having you on the show today, Eileen.
Thank you. You've asked such smart questions.
We're talking today to Eileen Myles about Afterglow, a dog memoir. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.